Revelation 6 through the very beginning of chapter 8 is where we'll start. We'll spend this evening. It's just the first few verses of chapter 8 which conclude the seventh seal. So we'll hopefully get that far. Just by way of review, and what we've looked at so far in chapter 1, John introduces it. He describes the visionary experience that he had that started it all with Jesus appearing to him and commissioning him to write. So he wrote these messages to the 7 different churches. And that was in chapters 2 and 3. In chapter 4, it said he was in the Spirit again and heard the voice calling him up to heaven. So he moved, went there, as it were, in the body or out of the body, we don't know. But he was transported to heaven. And not just heaven, but in a sense, the highest heaven, the divine throne room, the Holy of Holies, is where the divine throne room is located. And he has this vision of things as they are in the spiritual realm, and how they ought to be on earth, as it were, where God is at the center of it all, and he's receiving the proper allegiance and worship of all of creation. So he has this vision of God on his throne, and that anchors, as it were, all the other visions that we're about to see. Then in chapter 5, he sees a scroll in God's hand, and it's sealed with 7 seals. And there's this drama there of who's able to open this scroll, to put God's plan into motion, God's plan to fix what's wrong with the world, to set the world right, to save his people, to save his creation. And no one is found who's able or worthy to open it. And then he has the vision there of the lamb that has been slain, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And chapter 5 celebrates that he is worthy to take this scroll, to put God's plan into action. So that's where chapter 5 ended, a bit on a cliffhanger. And chapter 6 starts right away with the opening of these seals. So I don't know that, well, it's probably a bit too long to read chapters 6 and 7 in their entirety. So hopefully you've read them some in advance, so you have some idea of what's going on. So the first 4 seals function, actually before we get into that, seeing the big picture of chapters 6 through 8, the 7 seals. And I wanted to begin every week with a sort of summary section. Revelation 6:1 through 8:5 provides an overview of history from Jesus's enthronement. That's what we saw in chapter 5, the investiture, as it were, of authority of the Lamb. So his enthronement until his second coming, which we see in the 6 and 7 seals. The first 4 seals that are broken take place within history as human beings experience the consequences of their own evil. And this is what we'll discuss these points as we go through the chapters. The 5th seal is open, and it shows a response from God's people. They're experiencing suffering and they're experiencing persecution as history unfolds, and it shows how they're responding to that. The 6th and 7th seals describe the end, the great day of God's final judgment. And then in chapter 7, there's this interlude. Between the 6th seal and the 7th seal, there's a break where John receives some additional visions about the sealing of the 144,000. And this communicates God's ownership, protection of his people in the midst of the chaos and evil of history, the Great Tribulation. So that's the summary of what we'll be looking at in these 2 chapters. So then jumping right into them. The first 4 seals. The first 4 seals are connected to the 4 horsemen. And this is probably some of the most famous imagery of the apocalypse, the 4 horsemen. So it's been, parts of various movies or TV shows that will feature some Hollywood retelling of these first 4 horsemen. So Jesus proceeds to immediately open the 7 seals. Each of the first 4 are connected to a particular horseman. The first horseman is linked to human warfare and conquest. So it says, reading in chapter 6, verse 2, behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. The second horseman is connected to civil wars, civil unrest. So he opened the 2nd seal, and you hear the second living creature say, come, and out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. And the third one is connected to famine. So it says, I looked, and behold, a black horse. Its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures say, a quart of wheat for a denarius and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine. So the prices listed are 8 to 16 times what would be thought of as average at the time. So it's a time of famine. And these three function very logically. Sort of human warfare leads to civil unrest, civil wars, which is also linked to famine. So in the first century, this was a common connection of events all throughout human history. The fourth horseman functions as a summary of the whole group. So it's death. So we open the fourth seal, and this is in verse 7. I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death. And Hades followed him, and they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence and by wild beasts of the earth. So sort of summarizing the whole sequence of these first four, that they're functioning together as a unit, as it were. So they're riding out, and they're wreaking their havoc, as it were, on humanity. The imagery of Death riding out on his horse, and then Hades coming behind. So as Death slays people, they're gathered up. Sort of Hades gathers them as the place of the dead. So they represent this warfare, this chaos, this suffering that is taking place. So the four horsemen are parallel. Many people see parallels here between Jesus's teaching and the Olivet Discourse, and where Jesus, this is from Matthew's version, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. And all these are but the beginning of the birth pains." So when Jesus was teaching about this, he says these things will be happening sort of throughout history, the nations rising up, the kingdoms against kingdoms, the famines, the earthquakes. But he says the end is not yet. These are just the beginning. So sometimes Christians misunderstand this, and we say, well, the more warfare there is, then it's an indication of the end. And in Jesus' teaching, it's actually the opposite. It's the indication that the end is not yet, that these things are happening throughout history. And the imagery of the birth pains could represent this intensification, that things will get progressively worse as we get closer to the end. I think that's a natural reading of the metaphor. And that would also match in Revelation the intensification of the judgments, from the 7 seals judgments to the 7 trumpet judgments that we'll see next week, and then the 7 bowl judgments at the end. So there is an intensification. A quarter of the earth to a third of the earth to the whole earth is afflicted. So these things indicate that the end is drawing near, but the end isn't here yet. So the things that precede the end throughout human history. So similar to Jesus's teaching, John's vision presents these four horsemen as active. They're beginning with Jesus's enthronement at God's right hand. So we consider the timing of the vision in chapter 5. When did that happen, that he received the scroll? It's very likely connected to his ascension, his enthronement to God's right hand, that then he is given this authority to establish God's kingdom. So this is the sort of the timing of it, and he begins opening these seals from that point on, his ascension and enthronement at God's hand. So they're not special events reserved for a period of time right before he returns, but sort of this chaos of history. And it's a form of God's judgment of the world, which raises a question. The technical word for this is sort of theodicy. A theodicy is sort of a defense of God's actions and God's judgments. Is God doing what's just? So the question here is God to blame for the many innocent deaths which occur through human conflict? And I think that a really important parallel here is in Romans 1, verses 18 and following. And we won't necessarily read there, but Paul starts with this statement in Romans 1:18, that the wrath of God is being poured out against all unrighteousness and ungodliness of humanity. So he uses a present tense verb there in the Greek. Says God's wrath is being poured out right now against ungodliness and wickedness of men. But then as he goes on, he say, well, how is God's wrath being poured out in Romans chapter 1? And he keeps coming back to this dynamic where God hands people over to their own sinful choices. So if we spent time with Romans 1, you would see that repeated several times. So humanity rejects God, then God hands them over to their choice. So it's really interesting that God's wrath, God's judgment poured out in history is very much allowing human beings to reap the consequences of their own sin. And so it's judgment, yes, but it's a judgment, it's a permissive judgment. It's God allowing the natural consequences of rebellion and evil to have their effect. And so that's, I think, very similar to what we're seeing. The logic of that is very similar here in Revelation. So the judgments are coming from God. So the seals are broken, and the four living creatures are each summoning one of these horsemen. But God isn't directly carrying these judgments out. So he's allowing them. It's permissive as human beings self-destruct, or evil self-destructs, and evil causes harm. And so that's, again, I think the logic is quite similar to Romans 1, that you're able to explore that later, if you're interested in that. So the fifth seal, souls under the altar. Before we actually, let me make one more comment about the four horsemen. Sometimes people draw a connection with the first one and Jesus. So the first one's riding the white horse and has a crown, and that's similar to how the rider in chapter 19 of Revelation is described. There it's Jesus in chapter 19. But here I think that connection is very unlikely, because these four horsemen are functioning as a team. So sort of a demonic team that are instigating, or they're stirring up, magnifying sort of humanity's own evil. And so that Jesus doesn't fit well in that team. So he's not in the team that's being led by death, as it were. And so I think that's an unlikely connection. But there is an interesting point that throughout Revelation, evil tries to counterfeit good. So we have God on his throne, and we have Satan, the dragon. And it was mentioned in the 7 letters, I think Pergamum, where Satan's throne is. So there's a counterfeit to God. And then there's the sea beast in chapter 13, parallel to the Lamb. Then there's the next beast, parallel to God's people, who are trying to promote worship of their respective leaders. So there's this counterfeit all the way down. And then Babylon the Great is parallel to God's people. And so we see this sort of counterfeit, deceptive nature of evil throughout all these visions. So I think that's what's happening with that first horseman as well. This counterfeit of what might be good. So the fifth seal that is opened, nothing happens in the narrative. So there's no action, there's no judgment. John gets a vision of Christians who are also suffering through history alongside non-Christians. And this is the reality that we share in the same things: the sickness, the epidemics, death, the terrible consequences of conflict, of oppression, of famine. We're caught up in the midst of it as well, in addition to persecution, where there's active opposition to God's people throughout history. And we get more visions of that later in the book that reveal sort of the demonic or spiritual opposition to God that plays out in concrete physical opposition to God's people through history. So this fifth seal that's open gives us a vision of God's people. So the Lamb opens the fifth seal. Nothing happens in history. Time sort of stands still. And John sees this vision of God's people who've suffered. They've been killed for their faithful witness. And they're praying. They're calling out to God to bring justice. And this is a vision of God's people, what we would call the intermediate state. So we say, what do we know about this period of time between death and resurrection? So God's people don't have physical bodies, or renewed resurrection bodies, until the resurrection, at which point all of God's people who have died throughout history will experience resurrection, will gain resurrection bodies. So the eternity, as a word, is not disembodied. That's not the New Testament hope, but it's an embodied resurrection bodies, energized by the Spirit. So at one point, Paul calls them spiritual bodies, but that doesn't mean disembodied. So it's the idea that they're energized by the Spirit. Resurrection life in God's new creation. So between death and resurrection, there is the intermediate state. And some people describe it as sleep, as like soul sleep, that they die and then they wake up at the resurrection. But that's not how Revelation presents it. And so the believers who have died are at rest, but they're also alert. Like they're alert, they're active, as it were, in prayer, presumably in worship, as we'll see in chapter 7 as well. So God's people are never presented as sleeping after death, but very much alert. And even though they're disembodied, they are alive spiritually. And that's this vision we have in the fifth seal. And they cry out, "How long? How long, O Lord?" And that's the classic prayer of lament. So if you read through the Psalms, in the book of Psalms, this is repeated throughout, this cry of "How long?" And it's God's people confident in God, confident in his power, but also longing for God to finally end evil, to finally put an end to oppression and to destruction, to sin, to finally fulfill his promises. And so it's the classic cry of lament for God to act. And so I'll go ahead and just, I think, read these verses as well. So starting in verse 9, when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. And they cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Then they were each uh, given a white robe and told to rest a little longer, until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. So this prayer of how long? It's a prayer, let's say, how long till you judge and avenge our blood? And some people could read that and say, well, it's a vindictive prayer. It's calling out for vengeance. But it's important to recognize within Revelation, it's always judicial vengeance. So it's not revenge in terms of, they hurt me, so I want to hurt them. But it's a cry for justice. And this is a theme that we'll see all throughout this prayer, this longing for justice. So it's not, again, with human vengeance it's anger and wanting to harm for the sake of paying back, the harm that's been done to me. And that's not the sense we get through Revelation, but it's the prayer for justice. The altar is very likely the altar of incense because it's connected with prayer. So incense is always connected with prayer throughout. Well, in Jewish worship, the altar of incense is representing the prayers of the people. And we see that as well in Revelation earlier. So the 24 elders where had the bowls of incense, which were the prayers of the saints. And we'll see that in chapter 8, where the prayers go up from this altar as the incense is burning. And so very likely the altar of incense connected to the prayers of God's people. Now, this fifth seal is very important, again, not because anything happens per se in the narrative, so there's no new judgments, but this prayer of God's people for justice is very foundational to all of the judgment in the rest of the book. So we'll see connections back to this prayer at many points, that it's showing that God is acting, that God is not allowing evil to create chaos and disorder and harm and oppression forever, but that God will answer this prayer. So this is an important sort of early vision. The message from God to them alerts us to the fact that more Christians would suffer, more Christians would die for their witness before the end comes. And that's a common idea in ancient Jewish thinking, that there's a certain number of people who either need to be born or need to be killed before the end before God would bring the end. So that was a common idea in antiquity. So John seems to share that. He doesn't make a lot out of it. So this is the only reference to this in the whole book. This idea that God has the limits to it. And it's similar to, let's see if I put this here or not. Now, similar in some ways when Abraham is being promised about the future generations who will inherit the promised land, but people are living there. And so God isn't going to have them just go in and kick out the people who are living there. He says it's not time yet. The sin of the Amorites has not yet been fulfilled. This is what he says, I think, in Genesis 15 or 17. So there's this idea that the sin hadn't reached this point of judgment yet. And so then there was a delay. So this idea that there is a time limit set, there is a boundary to it, that evil won't run rampant forever, but that boundaries will still involve more people who will be persecuted and die for their witness. And that doesn't always, it doesn't answer the question maybe the way we'd want it answered. We may not always understand, again, why God delays, and we could join the prayer here and cry out, how long? So it's a very biblical prayer. It's not a prayer of unbelief, but a prayer motivated by belief, that we're longing for God to act. But we are called to trust in God, that when he acts, it will be the right time, and it will be linked to justice. So justice may seem delayed, and it may seem out of our power, out of our hands, but it will come. And laments like this is what I just said, is not a sign of unbelief or lack of confidence. So they give voice to our suffering, and they're motivated by faith. So this vision is crucial for the visions to follow. It presents God's judgment of the world as a response to the prayers of his people for justice. So that's the fifth seal. When we go to the sixth seal now, there's an interesting parallel, again, between Jesus' teaching about the end times. So when Jesus taught in Mark 13, but in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. So in Revelation 6 is some similar things. The great earthquake, the sun became black as sackcloth, the moon, full moon became like blood. Stars of the sky fell to the earth as a fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that's being rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved from its place. So it's not identical language, but it's quite similar. A sort of cosmic upheaval is what's being described. So the sixth seal describes sort of this complete cosmic upheaval, and then near the end of it, this universal fear and panic. So the language of cosmic upheaval was used throughout the Old Testament prophets, and it's used to describe God's judgment of Babylon, of Edom, of Egypt, and even of Israel itself. Now, it's interesting, when this language of cosmic upheaval is used by the Hebrew prophets, it's applied to judgments that took place within history. So they'll talk about the sky being rolled up or the stars falling, and it was symbolic of physical warfare and the physical destruction of cities. So it was used in this language of cosmic upheaval was used symbolically throughout the Old Testament prophets. So it's interesting when you come to Revelation and say, is it similar there? Is he using this language because it's a traditional sort of prophetic, symbolic hyperbole to describe earth-shaking events? Or is it describing this literal upheaval that will be associated with the end, with the final judgment and Jesus's return? And it's hard to discern that when reading Revelation. I think it could be read either way. The imagery pictures a decreation, which makes way for a new creation. So the sixth seal describes this. The final judgment levels humanity. And every human being, as it describes at the end of chapter 6, from kings of the earth to the lowliest slaves, are called to give an account, as it were. They have to give an account to God, who shows no favoritism based on wealth, status, or ethnicity. So the things that stratify, as it were, society now, whether it's wealth or power or race, whatever it is that leads to oppression and oppressors, and that's changed throughout history. None of that will help, and none of it will hurt in the final judgment. It levels, as it were, all of humanity. And the language there is so extreme and so devastating that it appears the end has come. The people describe it in verse 17 as the great day of the wrath of God and the Lamb. And all through the Hebrew prophets, you'll often hear this reference to the day of the Lord, and the great day of the Lord. And it includes always these two things: judgment of evil and salvation of God's people. So the day of the Lord is prophesied throughout the Old Testament, and it's linked with judgment of evil and salvation of God's people. Now, sometimes the Hebrew prophets apply this language to a day within history. So the day of the Lord for a certain city means that God's judgment would come on that city and salvation for his people in that city. But they often spoke as well of a future final day of the Lord. So sort of the day of the Lord throughout history are instances where God acts to bring judgment and salvation, but they're also looking forward to this final great cumulative capital D, as it were, day of the Lord that everything's moving towards. And that's what is being described here in Revelation 6. So it describes the day as belonging to both God and the Lamb. And that's very significant. So in the Old Testament, it's always the day of the Lord. It's God. So here it's the day of the wrath of God and the Lamb. So they're linked together in a very close and unique way. And we discussed that in past weeks in regard to the Trinity. So chapter 6 ends with a very important question. So if you hopefully have your Bible, you're able to follow along here. Chapter 6 ends with this question: the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? So he had seen in the vision, all of humanity is cowering in terror and in fear. No one's able to stand. They're trying to hide from God's wrath, but there is no place to hide. And the question is, who is able to stand? So that's where the sixth seal judgment ends. And there's a break before we get to the seventh seal, the whole chapter break. So chapter 7 gives us an interlude or a digression which answers this question: who is able to stand in the day of the Lord? Chapter 7 answers that question, and then we move on to the seventh seal in the beginning of chapter 8. So this interlude, and it describes a vision of two things: this 144,000 sealed from the people of Israel, and an uncountable multitude from every nation. And Revelation, this chapter functions to answer that question. When God's final day of wrath and judgment comes, who is able to stand? Who will be saved? As it were, is another way you could phrase that question. Who will be saved in that final day? And Revelation gives the answer. And the vision answers that question by going back in time to before the first seal was opened. And John sees four angels holding back the four winds of the earth. And let me just read this first part of chapter 7 for us, starting in verse 1. After this, I saw four angels standing at the four corners of the earth, holding back the four winds of the earth, and that no wind might blow on earth or sea or against any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun with the seal of the living God. And he called with a loud voice to the four angels who had been given power to harm earth and sea, saying, Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. And I heard the number of the sealed, 144,000, sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. 12,000 from the tribe of Judah were sealed, 12,000 from the tribe of Reuben. Then it goes on listing 12,000 from the different tribes. Then in verse 9, after this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. And all the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the four living creatures, and they fell on their faces before the throne and worshipped God, saying, Amen. Blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever. Amen. Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, Who are these, clothed in white robes, and from where have they come? And I said to him, Sir, you know. And he said, so John's like, I don't know. You tell me. And he said to me, These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. And then he goes on describing the believers at rest, again, in the intermediate state or in the final resurrection. So the thing to note here, the four winds that are held back at the very beginning, they're destructive forces. They'll bring harm to the earth, the sea, and the trees. So we could connect these four winds forward to the first two trumpets that we'll see in Revelation chapter 8. And those trumpet judgments target the earth, the tree, and the sea. But the four winds also connect backwards to the four horsemen. And this connection is not so obvious, but it becomes clear when we consider this four sets of horses in the vision of Zechariah. And this actually, this is easy to miss because it requires this chapter in Zechariah, which is not an easy chapter to interpret, but it also requires the Greek version of the Old Testament and not the Hebrew. And John was likely had access to both. So it seems that he quotes sometimes from the Greek and sometimes from the Hebrew, but more often from the Greek. So Zechariah saw a vision of four chariots pulled by four different colored horses, red, black, white, and dappled horses. The Greek version of the Old Testament, which John likely used, makes it clear that the four chariots were the four winds of heaven. So this connection, the four chariots are described as the four winds of heaven. And that suggests a close connection, if not identification, between the four horsemen with the four seals and the four winds. And helps us to see that God seals his people before any of the scroll's seals begin to be opened from the scroll. So that's, and again, it's an interesting point. It's easy to miss, but the four winds are very likely the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So John's seeing this vision here where it says to, let me pull it up again real quick. He saw this vision of the four angels holding back the four winds of the earth, that no wind might blow to harm. And before those winds are released, God's people are sealed. So before receiving an answer to the question, who can stand, John has shown this vision of something God did before any of these seals were opened. God sealed his people on their foreheads. Revelation 14:1 describes this 144,000 people again, and there it indicates that the seal was the name of Jesus and God written on their foreheads. So we don't see that here, but later in chapter 14, the 144,000 appear again, and there it's the name of Jesus and God written on their foreheads. The Old Testament background for this is in Ezekiel 9, the sealing. Ezekiel has a vision of God's judgment of Jerusalem because of their idolatry and injustice that was happening there. And in his vision, he sees a man in linen who places a mark on those who are faithful in Jerusalem, while other men come behind him with judgment, and they slay all those who don't have God's mark. So in Ezekiel 9, all the people in Jerusalem, before God's judgment comes, are marked, as it were, with God's seal, are marked with God's mark. And then they're preserved from the judgment. They're kept from experiencing God's wrath. So that's the sealing is a very similar function there in Ezekiel 9 and here in Revelation 7. So God's seal in both books communicates his ownership, his protection. Those who are sealed will not experience God's wrath. And this is proved later in the book in chapter 9. These demonic locusts are afflicting humanity, we'll get to next week, but they're not allowed to afflict those with God's seal. So it does not provide protection, however, from the wrath of the dragon in chapter 12. So we'll get to that in a few weeks. But there, the dragon empowers two beasts to kill those who don't receive the beast's mark, which is the beast's name on their forehead. So God's seal and the beast mark are set in very explicit contrast to each other in Revelation. And the message being, every human being is sealed or marked with a name of allegiance, either to God and the Lamb or to the dragon and the beast. So here, God's seal is mentioned first. God's seal has priority. It's preeminent. So before any of this starts being unfolding, God seals his people, the 144,000. So we still have some questions about this, I think, though. John heard the number of the sealed, 144,000, from every tribe of the sons of Israel. And then John hears a listing of the 12 tribes. Then in verse 9, it says, after this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number from every nation and tribe. So John heard with his ears a limited, incountable number of ethnic Israelites that would be sealed. Then he sees an uncountable number of people from every ethnicity standing before the throne. So the question is, how does what he heard connect with what he saw? And we mentioned this last time we met in regard to Revelation 5, the very same, it's a literary technique, I think, but it's a hearing and seeing dynamic where he hears one thing. In chapter 5, he heard, behold, the lion of the tribe of Judah. And then he sees, when he looks, and he sees a lamb. So it's very, very different from a lion, a lamb that had been slain. So the images are contradictory, but they interpret each other. And we see this as well in chapter 21. We see it other places, but these are the most obvious ones. In chapter 21, the elder says to him, come and I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he leads John up to a mountain, and John sees a city descending, the New Jerusalem. So he hears one thing, and he's about to see the bride, and he sees the city. So again, there's contradictory images, but they interpret each other. So this dynamic, what he hears and what he sees, is evident throughout the book of Revelation. And generally, the images are contradictory, but mutually interpreting, mutually informing each other. So then we come to this 144,000, and we say, well, what else can we learn of it? The numerical symbolism is important. So that 144,000 is multiples of 12. So it's 12 times 12 times 1,000. The number 12 in Revelation is always connected with God's people. So it's a number of the completion of God's people. So here it's 12 squared, and then even magnified even more by the multiplication of 1,000. When we get to the vision of the New Jerusalem itself, the bride of the Lamb, in chapter 21, we'll see many, many multiples of 12, because it's symbolizing this completion of God's people. The 12 apostles and the 12 tribes of Israel is one way we could think of it as well. So there's definitely an Israelite identity. That's as explicit as could be. The 144,000 are from the tribes of Israel. So it's an Israelite identity given to this group. It's also parallels can be drawn between census, various, what's the plural? Censes, maybe, taken in the Old Testament in preparation for holy war and for conflict. So Numbers chapter 1, and there's various other censuses that are taken in the Old Testament that sort of divide up the tribes of Israel and how many fighting men come from each. So the image itself is an image of God's people prepared for holy war, for conflict. And that's a metaphor that goes all through the book of Revelation, this idea of God's people engaged in a conflict, a military conflict even, but it's a conflict they need to overcome. but it's a conflict that they don't wage with human weapons. So there's no physical violence. God's people in Revelation are called to active resistance, but it's pacifistic. They don't fight with physical weapons. They fight with witness and with worship. So these are the ways that throughout Revelation we see God's people engaging in holy war through their witness, their faithful witness. So this image, the 144,000, they're counted as if it's a census for holy war. And it's a war waged with verbal witness and not physical weapons. When we get to the uncountable multitude, again, we have this vision of God's people in what we could call the intermediate state. So they've been through the great tribulation, they've suffered or they've died for their faith, or they've persevered to the point of death, to the end of their lives, and they've come out victorious. So they're the picture of God's people in victory, and they're worshiping in heaven. So again, it describes in, let's see, is it verse 9? Yeah, they're standing before the throne. So the divine throne room in heaven, the Holy of Holies, the presence of God. They're not treated as second-class citizens. So on earth, they're marginalized, they're oppressed. But in heaven, as it were, as they've come through, they've suffered, they're pictured as in God's throne room itself. They've come through the great conflict, it says, the great tribulation. Is how it's described in chapter 7, verse 14. So the Great Tribulation, let's comment on this briefly. Some interpreters connect this reference to a literal 7-year period of intense suffering that is supposedly going to take place right before Jesus returns. And so I've already sort of given the hint there, supposedly. I don't think that's the right way to interpret it. And we've talked about this in some prior weeks. For one thing, 7 years are not mentioned anywhere in Revelation. It's always this 3.5-year period that we'll discuss more in future weeks when we get to those visions. So there is actually no 7-year Great Tribulation in the book Revelation. The problem is that for John, the tribulation, this is the problem with trying to read this as a literal 7-year period. For John, the tribulation had already started in the first century, and it was going to characterize all the time until Jesus returned. So if you remember in chapter 1, verse 9, John described himself as a partner in tribulation with the churches. So he was already in tribulation. The churches were already in tribulation, already in the first century. The Christians in Smyrna were described as experiencing tribulation and would continue to experience it. In chapter 2, God describes his judgment of those who are following false teaching in the church in Thyatira as great tribulation. So God was going to bring a great tribulation, the exact phrase that's used here in chapter 7. So all of that leads to this idea that in Revelation, the great tribulation is not a technical phrase. It doesn't refer to a specific literal time period, but describes this entire time period between Jesus' resurrection and the second coming as a time of great tribulation. Now, it definitely could intensify as it gets closer to the end. So that's the whole narrative plot of Revelation is an intensification. But the phrase itself is not a technical phrase. And that's in line with the rest of the New Testament that views tribulation as a present reality. So if you study if you search the word tribulation as it occurs all through the New Testament, it's almost always the present reality of God's people. And then sometimes it's the expectation of a very near future, and then also the future tribulation that will continue to, that God's people will continue to endure. So Revelation's understanding of this great tribulation is parallel to how it's used all through the New Testament as the current reality of in the experience that God's people have in the present time. So when we come back to this 144,000 and the uncountable multitude, these two contrasting images show that God's people, before entering into deadly conflict on the one hand, and after coming out of it on the other. So forget that the first image is before the four winds are released. So God's people are sealed, sort of before the tribulation, and then they're shown this image of victory for those who have come out of it. So they are closely connected. The 144,000 are described in these two ways. They're described as servants of God and as those who have been ransomed from the earth or redeemed from the earth, purchased from the earth. So that's two ways that the 144,000 are described. Both of those descriptions are used throughout Revelation to describe all of God's people. So the 144,000 are described that way, but in these other verses I provide here on the screen, all of God's people are described as servants of God or slaves of God, douloi, and they're also described as those who have been purchased from the earth, ransomed from the earth. So those aren't unique descriptions of the 144,000, but they link the 144,000 to all of God's people. It also fits with this Jewish identity of God's people in Revelation. So we've seen some examples of this already with Exodus 19:6, when God rescued the Hebrews people out of Egypt. He said, I'm going to make them into a kingdom of priests. And John celebrates that God has done exactly that in Jesus. He's made God's people, Jews and Gentiles, into a kingdom of priests. So it's a Jewish identity that God's people have. In chapter 2:9 and 3:9, this discussion about who are the true Jews. And there, John identifies some ethnic Jews who, not all ethnic Jews, he doesn't apply that to all, but he says some in these two specific cities were slandering God's people, were opposing God's people. So they lost the right to be called Jews, as it were. By opposing the Israelite Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, these Jews had separated themselves from God's people. So ethnic descent is not enough. It's allegiance to the Jewish Messiah to be included in the Israelite kingdom. Also in chapter 7, verse 9, a very interesting phrase. This is the multitude from every tribe and language and people and nation standing before the throne. But it says a great multitude that no one could number. It's uncountable. And that's a similar phrase that's used all throughout the promises to Abraham in Genesis 15, 17, 19, as it goes on throughout Genesis. These are the promises that he would have descendants that would be uncountable, like the stars in the heaven, like the sand in the seashore. So Revelation 7:9 subtly, by using this phrase, which no one was able to count, is saying that this group, this uncountable group, is the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham about his descendants. But they're not just descendants by ethnic descent, but they're descendants from every tribe and language and people and nation. Then the last point we can mention here is that at the end of Revelation, there's a vision he has of all of God's people have God's name on their forehead. So not just 144,000 specifically ones, but all who are God's people. They're worshiping him in the new creation, and they have his name on their forehead. And then finally, to point out the theological nature of the list of these 12 tribes. So it's starting with Judah, and Judah was not the firstborn. So it's already an unusual list. The list doesn't match any other list of the tribes in the Old Testament. So it's unique in the whole Bible. It has Judah at the front because the Messiah is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. It includes Levi. Most lists exclude Levi in the Old Testament. It includes it because God's people are described as a priestly kingdom. It includes Joseph as well, but it kicks Dan and Ephraim out. And so those two tribes are missing. And those are the two tribes that were most associated with idolatry in Jewish history and in Jewish tradition. These were the tribes that had been compromised the most, as it were, with idolatry. And so it's a theological list. The tribes most associated with idolatry in the history are removed because that's the main threat that John sees for God's people, is this compromise with idolatry. Levi is included because of the priestly nature of God's people, and Judah fronts the list. So it's a theological list, as it were, of God's people. So all of that, before we move on here, so this summary, he has a vision of God's people. They're described as Jews because there is a Jewish identity of God's people. They're described as from these different tribes, which are the nature of the people, a priestly people following the Jewish Messiah from the tribe of Judah. And then 144,000 is well describing God's people. So it's the number is significant. So the initial vision of 144,000, they're sealed before danger comes. So that they belong to God. Their allegiance is to God. And then the trials come and the tribulations come. And then the next vision, the uncountable multitude, is described from every people group, every tribe, every language. And they're the ones who have gone through the tribulation, and they've come out the other side victorious. So the groups, they're not identical. There's a temporal difference. The one is before, the one is after. It's also likely, I think, that there's what we might call a salvation historical difference, that the Jews, all the first Christians were Jews, right? And so the Jewish identity of God's people actually matched their ethnic identity in the very beginning. But the promise from the Old Testament prophets that Gentiles, in the time of God's restoration of Israel, Gentiles will join themselves to Israel, will worship Israel's God. This is what was being fulfilled in the first century of the church, where it's a Jewish church, in the very beginning. They're all Jewish believers, but Gentiles start coming to faith, that streaming in from the nations, joining themselves to Israel and pledging allegiance, faith to Israel's God. And so that's also, I think, a progression historically from the Jewish core, where they are all ethnic Jews, to the final result, where it's a people of God that does not exclude Jews. There are Jews, ethnic Jews, but there's also people from every tribe and language and people and nation who have joined themselves to Israel through submitting to Israel's Messiah, Jesus. So that hopefully that helps. We could have some time for questions, maybe in a few minutes. So quickly, as we look at the seventh seal, there's silence in heaven. So the seventh seal is open. Let me just read this briefly. Chapter 8, verse 1. When the Lamb opened the seventh seal, oh, actually, before the last thing, so we said chapter 6 ended with this question, who is able to stand? Right? And I said chapter 7 answers that question. And it answers it very specifically in verse 9. So in chapter 7, verse 9, it said, after this I looked, behold, a great multitude that no one could number from every nation, from all tribes and people and language, standing before the throne. All right, so there's that connection. Chapter 6 ends, who's able to stand? Chapter 7 shows, here's the group. They're standing before the throne. They have nothing to fear from the wrath of God and the Lamb. So now that was the answer to that question, who is able to stand, which ended the sixth seal. So now the seventh seal, in chapter 8, verse 1, when the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and seven trumpets were given to them. And another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. So it starts with silence in heaven. And in Jewish, sort of contemporary Jewish apocalyptic literature, the silence in heaven, the purpose of it was to allow God to hear prayer, that the prayer would go up and nothing would hinder him from hearing it. So that's likely what is in mind here as well. There's silence, and the prayer of God's people from under the altar ascends to God's throne. Now, silence is also connected throughout Scripture with judgment. And this is evident in several places in the Old Testament, but particularly in Romans chapter 3, where it says, all the earth is silent before him. As it were, they're accountable to God, and when when people are standing before God, there's nothing that can be said in their defense. So there's silence. And so silence is linked to judgment throughout Scripture. So both of those ideas, I think, are possible. This silence linked to judgment, and also silence linked to the prayer that's ascending before God's throne. Verse 2 of chapter 8 gives us brief vision of the seven trumpets. And then verse 3 through 5 come back to finish the seal. And there it says, another angel came out, he stood at the altar. So again, that's where God's people are, the altar of incense, before God's throne. That's what we saw with the fifth seal. And he offers, he stood there with a golden censer. He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints. So this is the prayer of God's people for judgment. So how long till you act to deal with evil? So we're to bring justice. So here that prayer is going up. And then the angel responds, so the prayers go up. And then the angel takes the censer, fills it with fire, and threw it to the earth. And then the peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. And that phrase is repeated at the very end of this, the seals, what we see right here. It's repeated at the very end of the seven trumpets, and it's repeated at the very end of the seven bowl judgments. So that's how we know this is the end of the seventh judgment. So the silence isn't the seventh judgment. This would be the brief description of the seventh judgment, or the seventh seal judgment. Now it's curious that the trumpets are mentioned, and this has created some confusion for people, that trumpets are mentioned in verse 2 before the actual seventh seal is finished. And that's an interesting technique that John uses to link visions. And we see it again in chapter 15, where chapter 15 mentions the seven bowl judgments. So just mentions it similar to here, and then goes to conclude the prior section, and then goes to the seven bowl judgments. So here we have the mention of the seven trumpets, then you conclude the prior section, and then move on to the seven trumpets. So that's that brief explanation of what's happening here, where the trumpets are mentioned, and then he goes to conclude the seventh seal judgment. So summary here, and then we'll be done, I think, right on time, and we can maybe linger for a few questions. The scroll sealed with 7 seals, it represents God's plan to bring justice to the world and salvation to his people. So Revelation 6:1 through 8:5 provides this overview of history from Jesus' enthronement. That's what we saw in chapter 5 in the throne room, until his second coming, which is the great day of the wrath of God and the Lamb. So the first 4 seals represent this chaos and this suffering of history. It's a result of human beings harming each other in their rebellion against God. So they conquer each other, there's warfare, there's civil unrest, people slaying each other, there's famine that's accompanied that, and then there's pestilence, so epidemic, as it were, disease that follows with death. People are slain with this sword and disease and wild beasts in the world. So this is the result, I think, of human sin, of self-destruction, of evil. The 5th seal shows us that God's people also suffer intense and fatal persecution during this time. They're crying out to God to act, to avenge the blood of unjust persecution, of unjust oppression. The 6th seal reveals this cosmic upheaval. It's associated with the final day of the Lord. The 7th seal makes it clear that God's judgments are the right response to the prayer of his people for justice. So that's the 7 seals. And then there's this close connection between chapter 6 and 7. Remember, chapter 7 is this digression or interlude or break between the 6th and the 7th seal. And it presents a contrast between those who are not able to stand in the day of the Lord, which is Christ's return and the final salvation and judgment, with those who are able to stand in that day. And that contrast functions to motivate us as readers to be a part of the second group, right? This reminder not to compromise, to remain faithful unto death, to be part of that innumerable multitude, not the inhabitants of the earth who will experience God's judgment. So we said with rule number 1, the visions are intended to motivate us to overcome. And that's what we see here in these 7